All right, so my name is Mark Thompson. I am a lead front-end engineer over at American Express, and I teach a coding boot camp at Northwestern as well. And today's talk, oh man, I am all up in the projection, so I'm going to find a way to.
You angle this maybe a little bit there.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. Today's talk is called "This is Ridiculous." So what I noticed that is happening now is that a new JavaScript framework is getting its wings every 10 minutes. And based on that, we start to base our knowledge of JavaScript really on the framework. As we were talking today, Joe and I were saying is how you could know Angular but not really know JavaScript. Because what you start to get into is being able to create a controller, create a directive, create a service, and that lets you do very powerful things. And you don't really need to know a lot of detail. You get a lot of work done. And again, that applies to React, that applies to Vue, that applies to Aurelia, it applies to all the frameworks really, where you start to, even with libraries like jQuery, the same problem is still there. You don't really know JavaScript, but you know how to do jQuery. In my humble attempt to try to help the world get back to the foundations, I want to talk about one of the most confusing parts about JavaScript. This isn't a bad part. It is just a confusing part because we don't really understand how it works. And actually, like they call it ridiculous, because if you come from any other language, especially a classical language like Java, C++, something like that, this makes no sense when you're talking in JavaScript. Okay, let's jump around. My first example. Starting at line 9, I'm creating a function. Inside my function, I'm going to output the value of this, just to show where we are. Then on line 11, you see what I'm doing? I'm adding a property using a dot operator, setting a string of my prop equal to hello, and then I'm actually declaring a function called bar, taking the this operator again, adding another property. I'm going to execute bar inside the function called when I execute foo. Then if we jump down to line 19, I'm going to execute foo. Right after that, just to see what's happening, we're going to output the my property that I added and my other property. Now look, the hand is quicker than the eye. My other prop came inside my function bar. If we come from, again, a Java side, this is talking about the object. Because you have a class, you're talking about an object. In JavaScript, something a little bit different is happening. Okay, Control V, show me my, oh wait, there we go. So let me copy this path. Now I'm gonna just run this, and then we're gonna talk about exactly what happened. Okay, that's really small at the bottom, so let's make this nice and giant. Now let's talk about this. The first thing that I did was output this context in foo. Let's go back to the code. We look at the this context in foo on line number 10. If we look at what we just saw though, it said it was window. Why is it not foo? Why isn't the this context foo right there? Then let's go back. If we look at the next console.log on line 21, we check that same thing called myProp. Let's bring it back. It's the value for low. So if we can actually jump in right here, we'll get to see that's where that's being output, not in the function. So the property that I defined, too many finger swipes. So the property that I defined, the this.myProp, is actually being set on what? The window object. That's because JavaScript has a different way of representing the this object. The this object is actually contextual. What I mean is it depends on how the function was called. That's going to cover 90% of your cases. It depends on how the function was called. So let's look at how the function was called. Okay, let's do this. So if we look at foo right there, see, that's why I want to get the 10.
It's high. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, Microsoft. That's what I'm saying. Boom, Microsoft. Way to not embarrass me today, because sometimes this doesn't work.
It was very successful.
Today it worked. If we look right there, foo has no type of decoration to it, meaning it's not being called as a part of an object. It's just being called regularly. And when you do that, then this context, this object contextually becomes the window object. And that's why we saw what we saw. That's why when we looked here, we saw on the console, that console.log of this context was the window, even though I was in the function foo. Even though I was in the function foo. And then the reason I said I told you so is because even the my other prop, which was set in bar. So if we look at line 14, that was set in bar actually. So a function inside of a function, and then this context is still talking about the window object. And because I want to be as thorough as possible, let me just confirm or deny. Here's the window object, window dot my prop and my other prop, contextual this object. So that's one way to figure it out. Well, you say, well, Mark, I mean, I don't always call my objects like that. Well, let's talk about it a different way. Let's do this a different way. Here's what I find to be the most fascinating and what we'll find to be the most common case when we're trying to discover what the this context, what the this object actually is. What I like to do, so if we do console.log, I do not like to live code because something always goes wrong. I'm going to say console.log this.a. Whatever that this context is, I want the a property of that this context. So let's just add to our foo object a property called a. Let's add that. And from adding that, let's say Northwest Chicago JavaScript. So far, so good. All I've done is add a new property. I'm just have a function called bar. Then on line 15, I'm actually calling bar, but I'm calling it as a part of an object, foo. Let's see what the outcome of this behavior is. Let's jump in here. All right. Now, how do I know what the this context is? You can take the first example and the second example and actually put them together in one rule that's going to be almost universal. Here's what that rule is. When you're looking at a function and you want to know what the this context is, see, remember I told you about that sometimes? That's my arrogance has become my downfall. That's what I get. But look to the left. Look to the left of the function call. Look at the left. Look at the left. I want to keep saying this because this should be a habit that we have when we want to determine what the this context is. Look to the left of the function call. In this case, we see our dot operator and we see an object. So then, because of that, the this context becomes what? Or more generically, what is it? Whatever it is to the left. I don't ask trick questions. I don't like to ask trick questions. It's whatever is to the left. If you look to the left and you see an object there, then you know that object becomes your this context. If you look to the left and you see nothing there, it's probably going to be the window. But you may say, well, Mark, I know about JavaScript, and I know that there is something else where there's nothing to the left. We're going to get there, but first, before we find that answer, first let's just decide that if we look to the left, we decide what our this context is. Oh, yeah. No, so that's my doubting student voice. So whenever I'm teaching and I feel like my students are doubting me, I use that voice like, well, Mark, I mean, you just said this, but it was wrong. And so, because I teach a night class, I do all that I can to be engaging and entertaining because it's so late at night and we're talking about some challenging stuff. Because think about learning about the this context when you knew nothing about coding 10 weeks ago. It's a lot to take on, especially at 8:30. Here's an interesting example. So I just made this big giant fuss about look to the left. But there, of course, if you have a rule, someone always has to come up with an exception, and JavaScript is no different. Well, if we look at lines, so all the other lines are not as important. So we just see line 9 is foo, but then we look on line 13, and I'm using something called bind. The thing with bind, so if you look at line 13, you see foo.bind. I'm setting it equal to a function. I'm sorry, setting it to a variable. The function is going to be set to a variable, and then I call that function on line 14. Because I use the bind keyword, the this context is bound forever. Think of being shackled, locked up with no key to whatever I've passed in as a parameter to bind. Meaning, bind allows you to create a function that forever has a this context that you specify. So if you look to the left of the function on line 14, you may call me a liar. You may say, well, Mark, there's nothing to the left, so that must mean what? That the window object is going to be my this context. Not true in this case. This is where the exceptions come in. Because I use .bind, now that means whatever I've passed in as a parameter to bind becomes my this object. So in foo, this.a would represent the a on line 13. Now here are a couple of more that we can talk about. So what line 18 is doing, what I was trying to show is that, hey, what if I call something from the left and then it has a property which is a function? But remember what I said about being bound? How long did I say that happened? What was the word that I used specifically? Forever. So even though I have something to the left with object.myfn, because that points to fn, which was bound forever, that actually has higher precedence as the this context. So the this context still stays the same as it is on line 13. Call and apply are similar to bind, except for you don't have this lifelong commitment with call and apply. Call and apply allow you to just take a function, and then call is interesting because you say, well, the first parameter to the call is your this context. So then I take my this context as the first parameter. And then after that first parameter, those are just the parameters I want to pass on to my function. Apply, very similar to call, except for you pass your parameters as a single array. You're going to pass to the function. So if we were going to call the foo function, and I wanted it to have A, B, and C as the parameters, if we look at line 21, those are passed in individually as 1, 2, and 3, but the this represents the object I have highlighted. And if we look at line 22, we get a very similar experience. We get A of 5, which means this.a is going to be 5, but the parameters are going to be separated and passed in as A, B, and C, even though they're sent as an array to apply. That's just a different syntax. And why do you need this variation? It allows you to do some really cool things. Maybe you've collected all your parameters as an array, and you don't want to, and this is before you had destructuring and all kind of new ES6 things that would make this easier. But now you may say, well, I have all my parameters as an array. I just want to toss them into my function call using apply and have them be separated by JavaScript. Any questions before I move on to the next example? All right, excellent. Yeah, go for it.
So this before an A is what?
On which line are you saying? On line 10. So the value of this at line 10, you don't know. Even though your code's been executed, well, at least it's being interpreted from top down, you really don't know until it's called or until someone has done something like a bind, call, or apply. But call and apply are actually function invocations, right? You're actually executing a function with those two. Bind is really the tricky one because as you saw what I did, I actually tried to be a little clever here where I'm actually not calling foo on line 13. I'm creating a new function where this context has been bound to whatever my parameter was to the bind function. So it's so that's one of the caveats you have to be careful of.
So to kind of follow up on that line, if we had on line 12, if we called foo with no arguments, what would the console log?
It'd be window that A, right? Whatever A was in the window. And it'd be undefined probably. But be very careful about this. I found this out trying to teach to my students that I use the example of this.name. And I was like, why does it have a value? Because the window object has a name property. So don't use, if you're trying to show this to somebody, do not use name as a property. that will make you look really uneducated. You just say, really? You're trying to show me something you don't even know what you're doing. You don't know. How you going to tell me when you don't know? All right. We got two more, and then this lightning talk is really light. I'm trying to keep it very, very lightning. When you have a constructor function, remember constructors do what? They create an object and give it back to you. What is the this context for a constructor function? What is that one going to be? So I'd argue that you can use the look to the left rule here as well, because what's to the left of the function call on line 14? New. And I use that as a hint, right? Because I say, oh, new, so it's probably going to be a new object, and that's really what happens. So I use it as a hint to remember. So I look to the left of the function call, and it told me what this context was going to be. It's going to be something new. It's going to be a new, fresh object nobody's used before. There are no properties on it, just an empty, it's almost like there's an empty object literal being passed into there. So this is the easiest one, because if you're ever in doubt and you see a constructor function, you just look to the left and it says new, that's really your answer. And that just tells you right there, new. It's going to be a new thing. A new thing. Now, the future. So I call this last example the future because browsers, so we're losing support for IE 10 and even IE 11, right? Microsoft officially said, don't use IE 10. We don't even support it. They really only support Edge now. So what does that mean for us as developers and engineers is that we can now use newer technology because we can tell our clients, hey, you're using an outdated browser that puts you at risk. The company who created it does not support it anymore. That is a very good argument that you can say to a client. So if you're having a hard time getting them off of IE9, just say the company doesn't even support it anymore, you're at risk, you're not getting security updates, blah, blah, blah. Okay.
Move on.
Right. Enough. So I'm doing something kind of funny here. So line 13 syntax may look unfamiliar if we are not, bless you, if you're not used to the new fat arrow functions or rocket functions in ES6. So with the
call them rocket functions? Is that an official term?
That's what somebody called them. I saw it on the internet, a rocket function.
That's cool.
Yeah, it must be true. It's on the internet. A rocket function, fat arrow. I just don't like to call it fat. I mean,
It's not its fault. No.
I just don't want to shame anybody. Like, what's the point of that? Yeah, it's called an arrow function. So rocket is much cooler. So if we look at this and then we see our first parentheses, that's where our parameters would go. Then we see the rocket followed by our curly braces, and inside we're using this thing called this flavor. Now, because people really don't like how confusing this could be, and the new proposals, the this context inside of our function here, the this right there, that actually is this here. So whatever the context is at foo, the this context is the same there. That's the only time you can do that. But be not confused. Please do not be confused to say that the this context, if I were to make up a whole new keyword, because that was not function. So if I did function bar, and I did this dot flavor, not the same. Those are not the same. Do not confuse those, that these two things, that this guy and this one are the same. This one and this one are the same. But this one, and even that one's not the same. So the double arrow. Yeah. Thanks for the virtual finger though. That was clutch. It's clutch. So if we did equals cherry again. So the answer to bar, what's this context in bar? Well, what's the answer there? Yeah. You don't know until you see where it's called. That's the thing. You don't know. You can guess, but you really just don't know. Yeah, you don't know what the context of when it's being called is. So if I call it if I do bar right here, that's window. If I do bar.call and I pass in this, and I don't have to pass in anything else. If I do that, it's still ambiguous because now you need to know what is the this context of foo. And if you look at the bottom on line 20, in that case, it's actually going to be my object, empty object literal, if you look right there. empty object label. All right, that's it. Any questions?
That's why we can't have these things.
let's see. Come on. Yes.
Hey,
Right here. This is.
back up and start over.
Yeah, right. That is it. I'm just gonna make the most out of this. I'm just gonna draw a giant arrow. I'm just gonna say, because it finally works, and I highlight it. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate your time. And I need to show you my last slide. I worked really hard on this deck, so I want everybody to see it. Hold on. Go. Nope. Oh, I guess it doesn't want to be seen because it disappeared. Okay. Wait. Wait. And then let's be friends. This is how you can find it. And I put the lightning bolt there because I really wanted to remain lightning the whole time.
All
Just show.
lightning the whole time.
Just all lightning. Okay.
Flash. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Sweet.